Hello, everybody. Welcome to Free Kiwis. Today, we're delighted to have with us Dr. Nick Matzke. He is a senior lecturer in biology at the University of Auckland. Well, first of all, Nick, welcome to Free Kiwis.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So I just looked up your profile at the University of Auckland, and it says that you are an expert in phylogenetic biogeography. So what is that?
Biogeography, right, is the study of where life lives, right, on the planet. And it goes back to Alfred Russel Wallace, who was Darwin's kind of contemporary and was the first person to kind of write the book on the patterns of where different species live around the planet. And so that's kind of the history of the field. Um, Phylogenetic biogeography is an attempt to look at the evolutionary origins of why species live where they live. So over millions and millions of years, species have moved around on the planet, and this has created a bunch of the major patterns that we see when we look at where different things live. So, and a lot of this is accessible to even at the kids level, right? Like kids often ask, children's books will often have penguins and polar bears, right, in the same place because they both live in cold places. But in reality, the penguins live in the southern hemisphere, right, down to Antarctica, and the polar bears live in the northern hemisphere. So they could live together. If you put them together, they could be fairly happy in a cold climate, but they live in opposite places. And the reason for these kinds of patterns, right, is essentially evolution. Over millions of years, it takes a while for species to move around. It is rare that they cross large barriers. And so you can understand a lot about why things live where they do by understanding that history. So that's the big picture, so we're trying to explain patterns like why are marsupials mostly in Australia and to some extent South America. New Zealand is a famous puzzle in biogeography because we have no native land mammals. We have some bats that flew here, and we have marine mammals that swam here, but we have no land mammals. And that would not be surprising, for a lot of oceanic islands. Those islands are volcanoes that came up out of the ocean, and everything that got to those islands had to get there by overwater dispersal. And so if New Zealand was like that, it would explain why there were no mammals, except New Zealand has some stuff that looks really ancient. It looks like it's ridden around on this sort of Zealandia continent, this kind of semi-submerged continent. And so some stuff looks like it's floated here ever since the southern continents broke up, right? The ancient continent of Gondwanaland broke up. And so some stuff is written here, but mammals didn't make it. That's one example of a big famous puzzle in phylogenetic biogeography. You can tell I could just launch right off. Just the short version of my actual research, right, is I developed computer methods for trying to do statistical inferences of what those histories are. So instead of just kind of looking at patterns and thinking about them and telling a story, we try and build a computer model that can put statistics on the probability of different scenarios so that we can do more scientific testing of different hypotheses. So that's the sort of core work I do.
You mentioned the ancient continent of or supercontinent of Gondwana land.
Yeah.
Presumably your field was quite heavily influenced by the theory of continental drift in the mid-20th century. You mentioned it went back to the 19th century, but that must have changed the game considerably.
Oh, yeah. Well, that was basically what you'd call a classic paradigm shift, right? Where a big change happened in the starting assumptions of the field, and it really did change a lot of people's thinking. And that by itself is a fantastic example of a ongoing scientific controversy, right? I suppose it's a little less ongoing now than it would have been 20 or 30 years ago, but it's still this huge debate in the field. And you will see popular science articles about it. And you'll see, it's interesting, even in New Zealand, you will see as you walk, if you go through museums or go on some of the interpretive signs on hiking trails and things, based on when the sign was written, you'll see different answers to some of these fundamental questions. The key question is in New Zealand is always how much, which things in New Zealand have sort of ridden around on the subcontinent or on the Zealandia sunken continent, and which things have dispersed here more recently by floating or flying or being carried, as seeds in bird feathers or whatever, which things have gotten here more recently. That debate is known as the dispersal vicariance debate. So dispersal means things traveled over barriers. Vicariance means things rode around on continents that were originally connected and then were broken up by some geological process. So the short version of the history of the field is that Darwin and his contemporaries were mostly dispersalists. They thought the continents were fixed. So when you saw similar species on opposite sides of oceans, it must have been dispersal. So Darwin spent 2 chapters of The Origin of Species talking about the ways that things could disperse, and especially trying to argue that dispersal was more effective than people by default would have thought. So he actually did experiments, showing that certain kinds of seeds could float in the ocean and survive being soaked in seawater and still germinate. So from Darwin, 1859, for the next 100 years or so, most of biogeography was dispersalist. And then in the 1950s, 1960s, it turned out, right, everyone finally came to accept that the continents had drifted, and that the mechanism was these continents are floating around on the mantle, the molten mantle of Earth, right, the red hot lava down there. Our continents are essentially floating, and they actually move around very slowly. And this gave an alternative explanation for how to get similar species on opposite sides of continents, which is, well, maybe the continents were connected back in time and then broke apart and moved away. And maybe this is how you explain similar species on opposite sides of these oceans. And that was such a huge deal that it became a new paradigm, I would say, in biogeography, vicariance biogeography, and it dominated the field for several decades. And you will see much of that in museum interpretive signs and in trail signs and older books and things. However, in the last, it was a very important idea and a very almost romantic idea, right? You can, when you're walking through a forest in New Zealand, you can imagine that you're in a forest that's a relic of, the age of the dinosaurs, and you'll see these kinds of, almost poetic or romantic statements in scientific signage and things. The only problem is that in the last 20 or 30 years, a lot of evidence has accumulated that more things have dispersed than had originally been thought. So we're sort of swinging back towards a view that there's an awful lot of dispersal, and a lot of things in New Zealand have dispersed here, even though we do have some amount of really ancient groups that have been here since Gondwanaland, but a lot of stuff in New Zealand looks like it's dispersed here more recently.
That does include the podocarp forest, does it? Those species of trees which are not found in very many other places?
Yeah, well, the podocarps have been interpreted as a, the sort of relic of Gondwanaland idea. And that may still be true for them. They're a pretty ancient group, and there are fossils. I went and saw a fossil podocarp relative in these are the southern conifers, right?
Yeah.
I saw them. There's a fossil forest actually in Argentina, up in the Andes Mountains. And it's actually called Darwin's Forest because Darwin visited it on the voyage of the Beagle. And even back then, he said, well, this, is a member of this ancient southern conifer group. And he told the whole story about how it had been a coastal forest, and then the rise of the Andes had lifted these fossils way up, several thousand meters. And so, so that's one of the classic groups that seems like it could be Gondwanan. I have not read a super recent analysis of them specifically. Some podocarps clearly can disperse. Some of them have wind dispersed seeds. I did write an article recently where we tested a model where the actual traits of the cones of podocarps can influence their dispersal ability, because some of them have fleshy cones that are like red colored or blue colored, and they attract birds, and that may be a way that they can disperse over water. Other ones don't, and so you might predict that the ones with bird dispersed seeds or bird dispersed cones could disperse more easily than others, and we got some support for that. So there's clearly some dispersal in the group, and some of them have gotten out to somewhat remote Pacific islands. However, it looks like a pretty ancient group in general, and probably there's a lot of that ancient Gondwanaland in there. Similarly, there's some other ones, the southern beaches of New Zealand, Nothophagus, that's a famous group. And then there's a huge debate about the kiwi and the moa, right?
Yeah.
Because they're flightless birds, so obviously they didn't fly. Well, allegedly, obviously, they didn't fly to New Zealand. And so for many years, they were considered an ancient Gondwanan group that had spread with the breakup of the continents. But that's pretty much been debunked now because there are several lines of evidence that suggest that it's really a case of loss of flight many, many times. And one of the key pieces of evidence is that there is one group with phylogenetically, DNA-wise, inside of the what they call the ratites, the big flightless birds, ostriches, moas, emus, etc., kiwi birds, etc. One group within that is a flying group. And so unless you think that those birds re-evolved flight after having been lost, then you have to conclude there were multiple losses of flight. And if there were many losses of flight, then, well, they could have flown around. That's maybe not the end of the debate, but it looks like it's heading that way. And so probably those birds got to New Zealand early, probably sometime after the dinosaurs went extinct. They probably colonized New Zealand. It looks like they did 2 times independently. The Kiwi and the Moa are 2 independent invasions of New Zealand, and then they both lost flight in a very serious way, right? The Kiwis have even lost their front limb, or the Moa completely lost their front limbs, and the Kiwi have very reduced, barely detectable wings, you know. So, but yeah, that's an example of these kind of debates. And so my contribution has been to try, and these debates, you know, hundreds and hundreds of scientists have wrestled with these questions over decades and decades. My contribution is to try and make these more statistical and more a matter of statistical hypothesis testing rather than just sort of tell verbal stories and make sort of plausibility arguments. So yeah, but there's a lot of work there in that quantitative space because the models we use are quite challenging. They're quite complex models. And so there's a lot of, you know, I've had to learn a lot of computer science to make this all work, right? So I've gotten some grants in New Zealand and in my previous work, and yeah, we can hire students to work on it, and yeah, so it's ongoing.
So can you give us an example of how you might use inferential statistics in your field?
Yeah, so I would say, so the first thing, and cut me off when this gets boring, the basic way we do it is statistical model comparison. So most people are familiar, if they're in science at all, they're familiar with, you know, getting p-values on you know, you calculate some summary statistic and you get a p-value that sort of says how surprising is that statistic that you got. There's a much more generic version of that kind of calculation where you take 2 models and see how well they can explain the same data set.
Mm-hmm.
And
that's an empirical data set, is it, rather than
yeah, like an observed data set.
Yeah.
So it could be, in my case, it'll be the geographic ranges of, you know, 100 species and the phylogenetic tree of those species, and you see how well do different models explain those geographic ranges. You know, one model might have a lot of vicariance in it, right? A lot of ancestral widespread ranges that are broken up, and another model might have a lot of dispersal in it. So we can calculate the probability of the data under those 2 models, and that probability of the data is called the likelihood. And then you can compare the likelihoods and with various simplifications, whichever one gets the higher likelihood is the better supported model. And there are various penalties for model complexity so that you can, you know, you don't always win by having the most complex model. You get a penalty every time you add complexity to the model. So you're trying to compromise between how complex the model is and how well it fits the data. And so there's a whole world of, I would call it model-based inference there. And the sort of traditional statistics with p-values and linear regression and stuff like that, that's all just kind of a special subcase of this more general area.
I see.
So,
yeah.
So that all sounds very interesting. So maybe we should move on though, because I understand that as well as all this very interesting work in phylogenetic biogeography that you've just been describing, you were also involved in the United States in the debate about evolution and creationism, especially intelligent design. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'd love to. So yeah, I have this bizarre history for a scientist. In that, I'm now a senior lecturer in biological sciences. I teach evolution, but I didn't start out exactly on that pure academic track. I started out in evolution as kind of a hobbyist 20 years ago in the U.S. You know, born and raised in the U.S., And for many decades, there's been this fight about evolution and creationism and what should be taught in the schools. And that fight goes back to 1925, the Scopes monkey trial.
Yeah, I had
Dayton,
no idea it
Tennessee.
was still raging now.
Yeah. So but it goes all the way back. So we're almost at the 100-year anniversary of the Scopes monkey trial. And you'll probably hear some media about it when we get to 2025, because it's a significant enough event. But yes, this debate goes way, way back. And it was essentially a fight about what should be taught as science in public school science classes. So I was aware of this back in the 80s, mostly because of my grandmother. Actually, my grandmother, who's still alive, has always been a very conservative Christian, right? Lutheran Christian. And she would send us kids creationism books and things, and I would read those books, and then I would read my dinosaur books and my science books, and I observed that they didn't agree, right? And so I was kind of alerted to this controversy quite early. I was always interested in science and dinosaurs. But my main expression of this was, at university, I got kind of into, it wasn't a huge issue at my university, but I think just as a hobby, it was kind of the 90s, the beginning of kind of internet chats and things. I got into debating with the creationists, right? Just people are wrong on the internet, you argue with them. And at the time, there was a pretty good group of pro-science internet nerds, right, who liked to write articles rebutting the creationists. And the website still exists. It's called Talk Origins, or Talk.Origins. There was a news group called Talk.Origins and a website. And they put together an amazing early internet resource, explaining the evidence for evolution and why these numerous hundreds and hundreds of creationist arguments were incorrect, right? And so I got involved in all that. However, at the time, I didn't really realize, I knew it on some level, but I kind of thought as people who were evolutionary biologists were, Stephen Jay Gould and Richard Dawkins, you'd be super famous, you'd go to Harvard or something and you'd do that. I didn't really realize that maybe it would be a job that I could do, right? So I went and I did some ecology field work. I got a biology degree, but I did ecology. I got a master's degree in geography, of all things. I was interested in biogeography. But it wasn't, I could sort of tell it wasn't my passion. And so I got more and more into this fighting the creationists. And conveniently, this was in the early 2000s, this intelligent design movement appeared. And it was kind of a new and very sneaky variant of creationism. And the thing that concerned me was that knowing a lot about biology, I knew it was pretty full of it, but it was getting a lot of positive attention. And it was getting written up in mainstream media. And it was getting attention from state legislatures and things like that. And so various states were taking it seriously and considering putting it into the curriculum. So I, as somebody who'd had a lot of quite recent training in biology and biochemistry, a lot of the intelligent design arguments were about biochemistry. So I started writing articles, just on blogs and on the Talk Origins website, debunking stuff there.
So just to clarify what the tenets of intelligent design are, this is the notion that there is too much complexity in the universe for it to have happened by the laws of nature, by the laws of physics and so on. Is that about right, or approximately right?
Yeah, that's about right. There's a cosmological version, right? So you can sort of say the universe is intelligently designed. I would say the main thing they talk about, though, is biology. And they'll say that biological organisms look designed, right? In that, and they will say that things like the eye, right? The eye is the famous example.
Yeah.
The eye has many features of a telescope. It has a lens. It has a light capturing location. It has a retina, which can open and close to let in more or less light. And so just like humans have designed the telescope to capture light and magnify it, well, you can see those same engineering features in the eye, and therefore this arguably is an argument for a designer for that designed-looking eye.
Is this similar to the argument? Because I've also heard it claim that unless you have a completely developed eye, the eye is useless, and therefore people have a lot of skepticism, or from this school of thought have a lot of skepticism about where did the intermediate stages come in.
Yeah, exactly. That's the what good is half an eye argument, right? Or what good is half a wing? And so those arguments were popular with the traditional creationists. So creationists have a bunch of flavors. The more extreme ones are what we call young Earth creationists. So they think they read the book of Genesis in the Bible in a very literal way. And if you read it very literally, it suggests the universe and the Earth are only 6,000 years old. And so they deny not only evolution, they deny that the Earth is ancient. And those are the young Earth creationists. But there's another whole camp called the old Earth creationists that got a lot less attention in the 70s and 80s, but got a lot of attention during the intelligent design movement. They are willing to concede that the Earth is ancient, but they still think that evolution doesn't work and that basically God must have intervened to create the different species and their adaptations, like the eye and things like that. And so the young Earth creationists had a big push and wave of attention from the 1960s to the 1980s, and they lost some major court battles in the U.S. in the 1980s. And so creation science as a legal strategy kind of failed in the 80s. And but then the intelligent design movement appeared, and it grew throughout the 1990s. And they had a much slicker kind of presentation. They had some people with PhDs, making their arguments. Usually not, almost always not scientists, not biologists, but they were making these arguments, and they would swear up and down, we're not creationists. This isn't creationism. This will be legal in a public school, right? This will be legal in a government school. It won't violate, the U.S. Constitution has restrictions on separating church and state. And so you can't just use the public school to teach a particular religious doctrine. And so the creation science policies had failed based on that legal barrier. But the intelligent design people said, no, intelligent design is science. It's not creationism. And therefore, we can teach it in a public school. And we're not going to say, the Earth is young. We accept science on the age of the Earth. But we are going to say that intelligent design is a scientific idea. And we're not even going to say who the designer is. It's just some unknown intelligence. Maybe it was aliens. Maybe it was God designed things. And we ought to be able to teach that in a public school. And, if you say we can't, well, you're violating our academic freedom, and you're being closed-minded, and, you're biasing students towards atheism. And not all these arguments are consistent with each other. And, and you're causing the decline of culture and yada, 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 right?
Mm.
So anyway, so it was kind of a newish thing on the scene in the early 2000s. And one other reason I was interested was that they had some quite sophisticated seeming arguments, because they wouldn't mostly argue about the eye. The eye is a famous argument that goes back 200 years before Darwin. They would take the same argument, but use it in biochemistry. And so they would say, whatever you think about the eye, how do we explain these complex adaptations in biochemistry? So these molecular adaptations. So things like, the most famous one is the bacterial flagellum, which is a tail that bacteria use to swim around and infect people or do whatever they want to do with their swimming around. And it involves dozens of proteins that are all cooperating to produce the swimming motion. And so they basically said, how can that evolve gradually? How do you get evolution and natural selection to produce a flagellum when you need all the parts together for it to work? And this, was an argument that was a puzzle, right? There was essentially no work on the evolution of the bacterial flagellum. They had kind of a list of cases of similar molecular complex biochemical adaptations. There was a book, Darwin's Black Box by Michael Behe. Sometimes there was more that had been published on the evolution of these systems. The flagellum was kind of the one with the least. But anyway, I got interested mostly because I saw certain evolutionary biologists kind of flailing a little bit. A lot of evolutionary biologists, right? They are zoologists. They study fruit flies. They do population genetics theory. A lot of them don't know a lot of biochemistry. And so they would write rebuttals that weren't that convincing because they didn't know much biochemistry. Sometimes they just make mistakes and get systems mixed up. And so I said, well, at least I've had a lot of biochemistry and I know evolution. Maybe I can contribute here. So I wrote some articles. I wrote a big article on the evolution of the flagellum. It was just a web article. It wasn't published. But somehow that got me noticed at a place called the National Center for Science Education. in the US, which is the nonprofit that is devoted to teaching or devoted to defending the teaching of science in American schools. So the National Center for Science Education is kind of a watchdog group, and they would watch what was going on with science curricula around the country. And so after my geography master's degree, I decided I wasn't that into that. Just at that time, they were looking for another person. This intelligent design stuff was taking off. And so I got hired there. And that really was a radical shift in my life path, because suddenly I was full-time employed to do this creationism fighting that had previously just been kind of an obsessive hobby, right? And so that was an amazing amount of fun. This was in Oakland, California. And so I spent a couple years working there. And then just by chance, this happened to be when the biggest blow up of the whole intelligent design movement happened, which was the Kitzmiller versus Dover federal court case in 2005 in the US. And so Dover, Pennsylvania passed an intelligent design policy, which said that basically 15-year-old students would be read this mandatory statement saying that intelligent design is an alternative to evolution. There was going to be an intelligent design textbook that was in the biology classroom as a supplemental to their main normal biology textbook. And this policy was put forward. George W. Bush had just been reelected. And so at the time, the school board was very conservative. They thought that George W. Bush would nominate a bunch of conservatives to the Supreme Court, and that this would be what we call the test case that would take intelligent design and get the Supreme Court to approve it as being legal to teach in a public school science classroom. So, of course, what happened as a result of all that was that everyone else thought it would be a great test case too. So the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, and other groups filed a legal challenge. This turned into a year-long federal court battle. There was a 6-week trial. I was involved with the legal team making the case against intelligent design. So I did all this research for the legal team. I was at that trial for 6 weeks. In the end, we brought expert witnesses. We had paleontologists testify. We had philosophers of science testify. It ended up becoming one of these classic science, philosophy, religion discussions in a courtroom. It was all extremely entertaining, and you could not write a story that was, that had this. Well, you could write a story that had this kind of drama, but it was like being in a movie, right? It was just ridiculous. You had famous people showing up and talking and stuff. Anyway, the judge in the end, who was a Republican, Bush-appointed judge, he ruled that this intelligent design stuff actually didn't hold up scientifically. Furthermore, it was just a relabeling of creationism. And so he said, under the previous court rulings, which have already said creationism is unconstitutional because it violates separation of church and state, intelligent design is the same problem. It's just religion in disguise, basically. And so you can't teach it in a high school science classroom. And he wrote a 100-some page decision arguing for this. And so that was kind of the big defeat of the intelligent design movement.
Right. I mean,
yeah.
it occurs.
So it goes. Yeah, the story goes on. That's the essence of it. Yeah.
Yeah, but it occurs to me, setting aside the kind of quasi-religious angle, that when we think about evolution as a process that takes place over millions of years, there is a kind of intelligence to it. And what I mean by that is that the environment is constraining the way in which organisms develop over time that does design them. In other words, we can think of genetics in interaction with a changing environment as a kind of computational mechanism that sorts out the best design for organisms.
Yeah, so that's a somewhat popular view. I guess I'm allergic enough to the word design that I avoid it, and I would just say, organisms are adapted to their environment, or they
sure. But I mean that's an argument about which word to use. But
yeah,
I guess my point is that there is a computational process in train, which that's kind of trial and error, and there's this kind of ratchet of accumulation of adaptations, right? And so it does, and this is the whole Dawkins and Darwin and
many others have, made this argument that over long periods of time, this process can produce amazing adaptations. And it's sort of like Darwin said, over millions of years, this may outstrip the designing capabilities of the human mind, right? So
It's
really
kind of
the
like
eye
the
is
blind
far better than a
watchmaker.
telescope in many ways. Yeah, sorry?
It reminds me of the blind watchmaker analogy. I mean, that's the title of a Dawkins book. And there's the basic idea that, you might think that there has to be a designer, but in fact, these processes, which are sort of non-conscious or whatever you want to say, they end up producing something that might look to the sort of untrained eye like it's been designed by a conscious agent.
Yeah, and so that's that's all the famous argument, right? That goes right back to Darwin, and this is the main reason Darwin is a famous genius, right? Is he figured all that out and made the argument in a convincing way. So and so all of that came up, but it was quite interesting to have that same argument but repeated at the biochemical level, which is essentially what we had to do in the court case, right? And so I was one of the people that put together a lot of that research. You can imagine trying to make this argument, because the intelligent design people come with these biochemistry examples and they say, well, how could you possibly get this through a process of mutation and selection? How do you build up a function, as complex as the flagellum, which is essentially like a motor? It's actually got proteins that rotate against other proteins and spin the flagellum around, and that's how these things swim. And how do you explain that? And so I got deep into that. And I guess I might as well tell you the core part of the argument, which is if you read Darwin's Origin of Species carefully, or if you read Dawkins carefully, or any of these other famous evolutionists, the sort of first approximation of the natural selection argument is gradual improvement. So, and you'll hear this with the eye. Well, the way you get an eye is you can vary different parts of an organism, and you can make part of the skin more transparent, and you can have the nerves form the nerves be encapsulated in kind of a cup shape that can capture light, and you can just gradually improve this kind of light detection function until you get a complex eye. But that explanation, that gradual improvement explanation, doesn't work for many adaptations. It's just gradually improving the same function only works if you have that function it's to some level being functional the whole way. And this is exactly what the intelligent design people point out. But if you go back to Darwin or anyone else who's a real biologist who's really studied it, they will point out, well, is the second mechanism for producing adaptations, which is that structures change function over evolutionary time, right? And so it's not always just a process of gradual improvement of the same function. Often you get changes of function. And, a famous case of this would be bird wings and penguin flippers. So if you look at, penguins use their flippers for swimming, but the ancestors of penguins were flying birds, and the ancestors of flying birds were dinosaurs with forelimbs that they used for probably grasping prey. And the ancestors of them were, more lizard-like animals that walked on four legs, and the ancestors of them were, basically fishes that used their forelimbs for swimming. So you have this change of function from swimming to walking to grasping to flying back to swimming, right? And so if you really absorb that lesson, this change of function thing, then you can start to understand some of these biochemical adaptations. And it turned out, and I've done some of this research, it turns out with many of these biochemical adaptations, you can see related systems that have other functions. You can see that subsystems of these very complex functions, subsystems have functions in other places, simpler functions. And so it looks like biochemical systems often are built up by building up small functions, and then two systems get linked together to produce a more complex function. And so, so what was interesting about the whole thing, I mean, anybody can kind of just shake their fist and yell at the creationists for being dumb, but I think I tried to really research specific examples pretty deeply, mostly just because it was interesting, and it was kind of, some of these things were a mystery. How do you explain this or that? And so that's what gets me interested. And then sometimes you can publish that, or sometimes it's relevant in a court case. It's kind of wild. So anyway, so I have that. So this is my very strange background now, and I find it. I lecture about this stuff. I still find it fascinating. What I didn't expect, so then after all that, I went to get a PhD at Berkeley, which I did. I got very focused on the computational biogeography stuff. I went to do a postdoc in Tennessee, University of Tennessee. I did a postdoc in Australia, at the Australian National University. I met my partner there. And then I got this job offer at the University of Auckland. I said, well, that's great. I can go there. I can study evolution. There's a pretty famous group of phylogenetics evolution people in New Zealand and in Auckland and biogeographers. This will be great. What I didn't expect was for any of that weird American debate to sort of come up and be relevant.
Right.
In
So
New Zealand, of all places,
that
right?
brings us to a recent issue in New Zealand, which is the idea that Mataranga Māori, the traditional knowledge of the Māori people, is a kind of science, and there's a now famous or infamous letter to the listener written by 7 academics, I think 6 of whom are scientists, contending that this was not a very good approach to science education, and that we shouldn't probably treat Mataranga Māori and science as being the same thing. But rather than a reasoned debate about this, there was an explosion, a furor that ended up with 3 of those scientists being investigated by the Royal Society for heresy, it would seem.
Yep.
And that was eventually thrown out when Richard Dawkins and Jerry Coyne got involved. But tell us about how you came into the debate, Nick.
Yeah, so that's a decent first summary there of the whole thing. So what I was reflecting on, right, was the absurdity of my own existence, in that, I had moved far, far away from those debates in the US where there were, in the US, it was the science religion debate, and the kind of hard-edged pro-science people were Richard Dawkins and Jerry Coyne, right? And, and so I had talked with them a little bit. I've met them, and on occasion I had exchanged a few emails with them when there were specific points involved, in debating the creationists and things. But then, I moved far away from that. And then lo and behold, I'm sitting here minding my own business. I had kids in Auckland, I'm just studying evolution like I want to do. And then suddenly Jerry Coyne and Richard Dawkins are partisans, in this kind of similar debate, and similar in some ways. It's not identical, obviously, but this debate where you've got many of the same issues coming up, with some of the same arguments and some of the same people taking some of the similar positions. And I was thinking, if I had ended up at any of hundreds of other universities, I wouldn't be in this situation, right? But as it is, I'm sitting in the biology department. I co-taught evolution with Kendall Clements, who is one of the listener letter writers, and he was in the heart of this, still is in the heart of this controversy. So I just am sort of gobsmacked that it's come out this way. So that's my starting point. It's like, wow, how did this happen? But who knows how it happened? There's maybe God works in mysterious ways. I don't know. But so anyway, so I do have thoughts on the whole thing, and I don't know which parts exactly we want to discuss. But
well, I'm quite interested in how the debate really got out of hand, and tell me what you think about this. I mean, to me, one of the problems is that there's very poor understanding, certainly in the media and the general public, and even amongst some scientists, I hate to say, or maybe even high school science teachers, possibly even the Science Academy, about what science really is. And what I mean by that is that, to me, the heart of science is not the domains in which it's deployed, which tends to be the natural world, but I'm a cognitive psychologist, and that's encroaches on the human world, and there's no reason why we can't employ scientific methods in lots of different areas. But to me, it's those methods themselves that define what science is. So there's an epistemological basis to science that most people don't really fully understand, and to me, it's about having theories that are generalizable and falsifiable. So we have to be able to conceive of an experiment that would disprove an hypothesis or a theory for it to be a valid scientific theory. That's sort of after Karl Popper's thinking. But none of this refinement really featured in the debate at all. There was a lot of mudslinging and nasty name calling, and very little substance. So we never really got to that end of the debate.
Well, and the debate still hasn't really been had. It's been quite peculiar because, my general feeling is that most universities, most places, over most of the history of universities, it's debatable about the current cultural moment, right? Usually controversy is a huge opportunity, right? It's an opportunity to, because it's interesting.
If it's in good faith.
If everyone agrees, it's quite boring, but if there's a real disagreement, it's quite interesting. And that's the opportunity you have to motivate professors and students and the general public to engage in a debate and to bring many people who have passionate opposing views, who are scholars, who can present their views and debate them. And everybody learns from that. Whether or not people end up changing their minds is almost a secondary issue. It's a huge opportunity. So I find it bizarre that we haven't had the debate yet. I can understand parts of why, but yeah, I agree. Part of the problem in the debate is this issue of what is science? What do we mean by science, right? And I think your description was reasonable. I mean, if you're going to get into particulars, I like to say that science relies on testing hypotheses rather than falsifying them. Falsification is kind of a special case of testing. Sometimes you can't strictly falsify things, blah, blah, blah. None of that matters very much. But yeah, the key idea of testing your ideas against the external world is crucial to science, and doing it in a kind of a formal way. It's a bit more than just trial and error that all humans have done since we started banging rocks together, right? It's formal in that you have a theory or a hypothesis that is kind of formalized. You can't say that every scientist works exactly this way every single time, but they usually, I would say it is extremely common that scientists do have an operating theory that they are trying to get evidence for or against. And, and if all you've got is that theory or that story, it's just a story, it's okay to spend some time exploring it, drawing out the implications of it, but you're not really, the real goal is to test it, right? Expose it to challenge. And because that's the only way you can tell if you've just got a story or you've got something that's worth further investigation. So that is part of it. I would say one other crucial feature of all that, which I've gotten very exposed to because of the creationism debate, is really the concept of naturalism, or what we would call methodological naturalism. That's the idea that science relies essentially on natural law or natural processes to explain natural phenomena. And it turns out,
by that you mean that it doesn't appeal to supernatural causes.
There's no supernatural rule, right? So now there's some debate about this, I suppose you could say, amongst, usually I'd say philosophers who don't get it, but I think the entire idea of testing ideas relies on some concept of the regularity of nature, such that you can suspect that if you have a certain explanation of a certain phenomenon, it'll be roughly the same today as it will be tomorrow. It'll be roughly the same in this country versus another country.
Or on Earth versus on Mars, or some distant galaxy.
Mars. And so that concept of the regularity of natural law is a crucial concept. And that is, I think, a pretty unique invention in human history. It's not really, I think it basically comes out of Christian Europe, and this sort of concept of a lawgiver and natural laws. The modern science, if you sort of take it back to basically Galileo in the 1600s, it was kind of the combination of this concept of natural law plus the idea that we could describe those laws mathematically. That leads to the idea that you can test things quantitatively instead of just kind of in a more loose way. And that is what really took off and revolutionized the world. And I think when we talk about science, that's kind of the model. Now,
there's an attitude that comes with it too, I think, which is that there's no sacred ideas. So that's related to the let's rule out supernatural causes. But it's more about the attitude that we're not going to have any ideas that we consider too important or too sacred to sacrifice to observation and refinement
That's
of
right.
our.
Observation is first, and I forget what the original motto of the Royal Society in England was. Is it test everything or something like that? Don't trust anything. But that is a crucial idea that tradition, has no special authority in science, right? There is a sense, right, that if you are an expert who studied something a lot, you have a lot of credibility. People will take you seriously when you're talking in your domain. And as a approximation, if you are not an expert and somebody is an expert, you will tend to defer to them on their expertise. But that's not an absolute authority, right? That is just a starting point. And if you have the world's greatest expert and the data is against them, they should admit they are wrong, basically.
Yeah.
And if they don't, then their credibility goes down. So the ultimate authority is nature, right? It's the empirical stuff out there. You could go into the weeds about other things. Their logical coherence and some other features are kind of important in science.
Right,
but that's the core of it.
Yeah, okay. So I agree that's a pretty good working definition of science. So can we maybe draw you on the extent to which you think there is science within Maturanga Maori? Because if you use the Royal Society's own definition of Maturanga Maori, it seems to include things which are surely not science at all, or certainly not science at all, right? Like songs and prayers and things like that.
Yeah.
So then I think the productive debate is about those areas of traditional Maori lore which look quite sciencey, and I've seen people defend these areas quite strongly, saying things like, how could the Polynesians have migrated across the ocean so effectively and found all these tiny islands? I mean, obviously New Zealand has bigger islands, but they've very successfully navigated these waters using only the stars and the wind and the waves. Is that not a type of science? What would you say to that?
Yeah, in all honesty, I don't think so. I think it's technology. I think it's practice. I think it's skills. And I think all of those are important and valid and impressive, right? And of course, every culture everywhere in the world has developed a lot of local knowledge, local technology, et cetera. And that's all well and good. I don't think any of it quite rises to my version of science, which really is sort of that, natural laws plus explicit hypothesizing plus sort of deliberate testing, ideally mathematically, deliberately discounting authority in favor of empirical evidence, ruling out the supernatural. I think those are the core features, and the way to sort of expose this is to ask people on any topic, not just Maturanga Maori, you've got this thing you'd like to include in science, just ask them, does it commit to those premises or not, right? And it's fine if it does, it's fine if it doesn't, but and even if you want to call something science, you could have, science A and science B. Science B would be the one I've talked about that has these kind of restrictions to natural law and testing and stuff. Science A could just be, anyone's sort of knowledge about something. It almost doesn't matter what word you apply in a sense, but what scientists are doing in science departments and what we should be teaching in a science classroom, I think, is that science B.
So science A, I mean, another term which people bandy about, and I quite like, is proto-science. It's kind of on the way to a fuller conception of science, but it's not quite there. Would that be okay for science A?
These terms, they don't drastically offend me, and if it helps students get interested, or it's
because there are also differences between things that aren't sort of modern science, which sort of came to us from early modern Europe, right? So there's a difference between, the science, the science, as it were, that they had in China or in Abbasid Baghdad, and a more simple level of civilization, should we say, when people didn't have literacy, and they didn't even have stocks of knowledge in libraries, and they didn't even have any types of measuring implements. But so once you get to sort of 10th century Baghdad, or you get to some of the achievements in China, developing compasses and gunpowder and things like that, you want to be able to differentiate that from just the kind of default trial and error that.
Well, again, those things are technologies. They're not necessarily the products of the kind of process that Nick's talking about.
Yeah, I mean, you could.
although they do also have, I guess what I'm trying to get is they have some methods for arriving at those technologies, which maybe get some of the way towards a more mature science. But I agree that they don't, there's also another step change between that and the kind of science that goes on in modern university departments across the world.
Yeah, well,
I just think we need to
yeah,
be able to capture these different stages, right?
yeah, it gets very complex. I mean, you could talk about natural philosophy just in the European context, right? Before we started really talking about science, we had natural philosophy, and many of the early, what we now call early modern scientists, would call themselves natural philosophers. We still have PhDs, which are philosophy doctorates. So that reflects that tradition. I think the straight and narrow version of what modern science is, right, distinguished itself from those more general and older intellectual traditions. There were intellectual traditions, they were academic, they were scholarly, but they weren't quite, even those weren't quite what we would call modern science, right? So I think it's even another step to go to more remote things. I guess I'm a stickler on that definition because I think it does matter for the purposes of thinking about modern, like by modern I mean like today, the last 100 years society, right? What should be guiding policymakers if they want to base policies on a good understanding of natural processes, a good understanding of facts, right? To the extent that they want to do that, I think what you need is the modern version of science for that, especially on anything that's remote from kind of everyday experience. So
that's a key thing as well, isn't
yeah.
it? I mean, one of the other differences, it seems to me, exists probably between traditional knowledge bodies like Mātauranga Māori and science, as we're discussing it, is that traditional knowledge tends to favour the local, things that are true in the local time and space for people who live there, with quite practical ends in mind, whereas science is tending towards the universal. We would like our explanations to be as generalizable as possible. So there's that sort of philosophical difference as well.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. Yeah, you can. I mean, of course you can do science about local questions, local issues, but it is true the highest goals of science tend to be these broad, generalizable, fundamental theories, right? And that is, and even that concept, I think, is somewhat unique to science, right? This idea that there are these universal laws, that there are these general explanations, and it works, and I think there are some legitimate areas here where, like, I am not, or I try not to be a scientific fundamentalist, right? I do like my sort of definition of science and keeping it pretty narrow, but I like doing that because I also believe that many other academic disciplines, for example, are valid and useful human activities, valid and useful university activities. They deserve funding, they deserve cultural attention. And I would include everything from history to literature to law, social science, et cetera, right? And so I try not to be a scientific fundamentalist. And I think in that framework, if one adopted that framework, then you can see Mātauranga Maori as being an addition to that and valid to some extent on those terms. But a lot of people don't like this this framing of the whole thing, right? A lot of people want to call Mātauranga Maori science, and there's a lot of people that think you are, in a very bad place if you start disagreeing, right?
You're being racist, basically, right?
Yeah, you get that sort of claim. It's not always that explicit, but and so that is an interesting zone to discuss, right?
It's almost as if they are, and they're not the only ones to have done this. We might think of political science as well. Other people who have wanted to adopt the term science, possibly because of the status that they perceive that it will confer upon their area of study.
I was just going to go there. It's absolutely ubiquitous, right? So there's not just social science and political science, right? There's or communication science. There is Scientology. There's Christian science, right? There's a million and one things. And many, alternative health medicines and things we call pseudoscience attempt to adopt kind of a science-y, terminology, authority, language, all of that to try and get in on that authority. And so there's this big issue of the cultural authority of science, right? Even the creationists, creation science, right?
Mm-hmm.
They didn't call it, creation art or creation philosophy, right? They went straight for science, and they did it quite explicitly. And they would say things like, the reason we need this in the science class is that science, has the ultimate cultural authority in modern society, or something like that. And typically, they're coming from a evangelical Christian background, and they would like a different thing to be the ultimate cultural authority, right? And they're trying to get back to that, but they feel like in the modern culture they had to do it in a science way to get it taken seriously, right? So that is an expression of the cultural authority of science. And so you do create this, or we are in this weird situation, and we have been since presumably the 1800s, or maybe before, probably since Galileo, right? The achievements of science is strictly defined, the narrow version of science. The achievements are so spectacular and so stunning from the point of view of anybody before that, right? That there's this massive cultural authority, and again you see attempts to bring other things in, and so for me that makes me suspicious of all of those attempts, right? And so that informs my take on the current debate. I do wish there was a lot more, and if we had, some nice big symposia and discussion forums and seminars and things, we could debate all these things. It's not at all obvious that because science has authority, and because it's got cultural authority and it has this history of success, that it's not at all obvious that means everything else should either try and imitate it or try and claim that status, right?
Right, and if we give the name to all these other things which maybe don't have the same power because they're using different methods, then it's just going to lead to a kind of inflation in the sense that the term itself is going to be downgraded in its value, right? And people will stop trusting science so much.
In the whole labeling thing, the thing is, and this is one thing that I don't know, the 2020s have completely lost the plot on this, but applying labels doesn't actually change anything.
That's right.
In so many areas, right? Yeah. You could force a change in terminology, but it doesn't change the fundamentals of the situation. It's just a new name, and you can make communication more difficult, and you can make things more confusing, but you don't actually change the fundamentals on the ground. And and so you could come up with a new word for science.
Yeah.
Like I said, science B. Because there's this intrinsic relationship, right?
The trouble then is that over time, science B would gain the status that science A doesn't have, and then everyone would want to call their thing science B.
So that's right. That's exactly what would happen.
Modern science or something.
Yeah, but the successes of science are, I would argue, intrinsically tied to those premises or rules or method of science, right? Yeah. And the authority comes from the reason science works is that it's been checked a bunch of times against empirical reality, and anybody who doesn't do that, isn't going to achieve the same success. Basically.
That's right.
Yeah. So
Nick, we're actually coming up to an hour, so we do want to let you go in a minute. But I actually had two things in my notes that I really wanted to ask you about because what we're doing now, I suppose, is just kind of having this debate, which we were sort of not meant to have, but let's have it anyway. And I want to get down into the weeds of just two concepts that I think are particularly interesting in this debate, and they've both sort of come into the curriculum, or they've been sort of suggested, proposed for the curriculum, and they've gone in and out of various areas. So the first one you've actually just written about on this great new website called Plain Sight, which has been started by Dane Giroux of the Free Speech Union, and that's Maori. And so this is the idea that there's a kind of vital force in all particles, and I'll ask you the same question that I just recently asked Paul Kilmartin on the New Zealand Initiative podcast, which is just, let me try and play the devil's advocate here. So maybe it's just a nice idea. So things are just working as they are, and we can explain them in scientific terms, but then we just add in a little way of looking at it, which is like, it's a nice way of looking at particles that they're all infused with life force. And, Maori culture has been marginalized in the past, so it's not part of the system. It's just a nice way of thinking about it. What's wrong with that?
Oh, boy, yeah. So this one blew me away, and it was again another feeling the absurdity of my existence, because not only was there was this general debate, and so the listener controversy happened in the middle of 2021, and they were criticizing this concept of parity for Mataranga Maori in Western science. There was some language that the Ministry of Education had put out. They were criticizing that, and at the time, I didn't take it too seriously. I said, well, that language could mean a lot of things. I'm not going to get too worked up about it. Presumably, common sense will prevail. And then at the end of 2021, this thing came out in the chemistry curriculum, which had the statement, this is for 15-year-old students, based 14, 15 years old. In the chemistry curriculum, they're talking about atoms, conservation of mass, particles, chemistry, and they have this line, all matter contains Maori, right? And something else about particles contain Maori. And when you look in the glossary of these chemistry science standards, it says Maori is defined as vital essence or life force, right? And there's some other language in there. In some other contexts, Maori can basically mean health, and you could talk about the health of an individual or the health of an ecosystem. And in that zone, I'm basically okay with it. There are some complexities there because health is actually quite a murky concept, and ecosystem health is even murkier. But
seems a superfluous concept to apply to atoms.
Yeah, so to atoms, there's no way it applies to atoms. This is going back to this life force concept, right? So atoms don't have health, right? Particles don't have health. It's totally meaningless. So the standards must be referring to this life force thing. And the problem with that, right? It was an immediate. As soon as I saw it, I was like, this is a big issue, and it's because like I wrote on that Plain Sight website, right? If the concept of life force is correct, then all of chemistry and biochemistry are wrong, right? So the whole construction of modern chemistry and biochemistry, the experimental construction of it was built on, in part, debunking the concept of vitalism. Vitalism is this idea that there's a life force, sort of spark of life in living things, or maybe more generally in matter, right? And all of that very gradually was debunked, fallen apart. Basically, no evidence could ever be found for it, and different theories of how it worked, that did make predictions were debunked. So, and there was a famous experiment by Friedrich Wöhler, Germany, in 1828, where people had claimed, well, there's these organic molecules that they only come from living things, so there must be something special about living things. And he did an inorganic synthesis experiment that produced those same chemicals. Urea was the chemical. Mm-hmm. And this was one of many instances where it turned out that life is just really complex chemistry. And if you contradict that, you are challenging the sort of universal scientific consensus on this issue. And the consensus isn't even important. It's all of the evidence on which modern biology and chemistry are built. So you can challenge that if you want. That's fantastic. If you think you've got a challenge, go for it. But you got to tell us what the evidence is. You got to tell us exactly what is meant, and you got to tell us, how other people can test it and verify it.
And presumably there'd be an even longer process before it's so well entrenched that it's allowed to get into the school curriculum, right?
Well, that's true too.
Usually what you put in the school curriculum is the stuff that's really well known.
Yeah, the people who start in with the high school science curricula, right? That's what the creationists and the intelligent design people did. That's not a great model to follow, right? The usual way, you can have a scientific revolution, you can change fundamental things in science, but you have that argument amongst the experts who have access to the data in the experiments. Then if it's accepted there, it goes to the wider scientific community. If it's accepted there, it gets in the textbooks, the university level, and then eventually it filters down. Starting it in reverse, right, is hazardous and is, that's the kind of thing fundamentalists do. So, it's an attempt at cultural engineering.
I agree.
Essentially political directives intruding on science education. So now there can be a debate. We don't know exactly what was in the heads of the folks who put this in at the Ministry of Education. The alternative theory is the screw-up theory, right? That somebody was a little bit overenthusiastic and only had a vague idea of some of these concepts. And I've heard suggestions that maybe they thought Maori meant energy, or maybe vital essence means mass is conserved or something. There's no evidence really for any of these speculations, but maybe that was what was in their heads, and they didn't update the glossary, And so maybe it's not, literally an attempt at cultural engineering.
Very charitable of you.
Yeah, we'll see. Like, it's but it was, that isn't the most important part of the argument. It'll be interesting. I expect at some point in the future there'll be a little history of this issue that's written, right?
Can I actually ask you about a separate concept? The second one I wanted to get to was actually whakapapa. And this is super interesting considering what you were talking about in terms of your own research, because I've seen this referred to by sort of sociologists and people who study Maori culture as like a really powerful, almost a master concept within sort of Ta'ao Maori, the Maori worldview. And so I've also seen it claimed most aggressively. The claim is in the following form, that we knew all about how beings are interrelated before you white colonizers came down and you taught us genetics and evolution and stuff, but we already
should probably
knew.
Explain for the sake of listeners who might be international that whakapapa means lineage,
right? So
something of the sort.
Yeah, so that's a good point, Michael. Thanks. So within New Zealand, people often, in the Maori culture, people often introduce themselves in terms of their whakapapa, how they're related to the ancestors, and that can help situate people within a network of kin, and that's all very great and interesting, and people, of course, are free to do that if they find that interesting. But then you have this argument that actually that idea of ancestry is, that's all you really need to know to understand genetics and the interrelation of beings in evolutionary time. So yeah, what do you think about whakapapa, Nick?
Yeah, so whakapapa was also in that same chemistry and biology standard that had the Maori thing. Whakapapa was in there, and the thing that appeared to me was it sure looked like somebody had gone through, and every time the word evolution had been used, the word whakapapa was replaced with that. And there's a few issues there, like, what would I say? The basic issue, I get suspicious when the E word of evolution is avoided, right? And that's part of my own history. Like, it was a tradition in many parts of the US, if they couldn't get creationism in, they would kind of suppress the E word evolution. So and that's an American thing. I'm a little bit suspicious about that. The thing is, the word evolution does have quite a specific scientific meaning, and that is the word that ties you to the broader science literature. So I think it's important to have that word in there. Can whakapapa be used to mean phylogeny, for example, right? The evolutionary tree of species. Can it be used to mean genealogy in a scientific sense, right? Inheritance. We even in English, words like heritage, inheritance, heritability, genealogy, phylogeny, all of these things, these are all related words referring to various versions of relationships, right? And so whakapapa clearly is linked to a lot of that kind of thing. And so it doesn't, if it were commonly accepted, if it were agreed that, it's that we can use whakapapa in a very kind of loose way to refer to modern scientific concepts of inheritance and genealogical relationship, it actually doesn't offend me. But what makes me a little bit suspicious is that, so this is a quite specific story. I was applying for a grant, right, in New Zealand, and I was asked in the grant review panel, I was asked, what is there a connection to Vision Mataranga, right, which is the New Zealand, there's sort of a policy about Maori engagement for science funding, right? Is there any Vision Mataranga component to your research? And I said, the best I had, I work in computational phylogenetics. I'm mostly about, improving computer models for studying these macroevolutionary questions that cover millions and millions of years, and so I said, well, the only real connection here is, so I said something like, some people would say that studying phylogeny and evolutionary history is exploring an aspect of whakapapa. And I had gotten that from a Maori lecturer who I had heard say that kind of thing. And I got in the grant review panel from the Maori expert on the panel. He said, well, I don't think that, right?
Oh, interesting.
And when you're trying to get a grant, right, you sort of go, oh boy, I misstepped there, right?
Yeah.
So to that senior established Maori academic, he did not agree that you could just translate whakapapa into phylogeny, right? So, and that's fine too. I don't have an opinion there. I just want to kind of get it right, So, but if there is disagreement over what that means, and if you can make that simple translation, then it seems a bit bold for the Ministry of Education to just make that move and do it systematically. And honestly, they've probably done that for a number of scientific terms throughout the curriculum. And if it's true, everyone's kind of cool with that. Maybe it's okay. But if they're oversimplifying things, if they are, basically sliding across or running roughshod over important, meaningful distinctions, right, then that's kind of problematic. And there's a chance that you could, if you're going to put this in the curriculum for all New Zealand students, right, you could accidentally be engineering the Te Reo Maori language. You could be changing the meaning of words, right? And sort of scientizing a bunch of Maori concepts that had all kinds of additional meanings and things. So, so it strikes me as at least debatable. I haven't seen any debate about these things. So, that's one issue.
That last thing that you just raised strikes me as being a very valid point. And I've written about this myself a little bit, that actually, let's set aside science for a moment and look at the impact of this debate on Māori worldview and their understandings. It seems to me quite disrespectful to that, to be just taking their words and peppering them through the curriculum in order to make a political point almost.
Yeah, and whether it's hard to say exactly what the motivation is. You get the feeling from reading some of the curriculum that the motivation was there was this top-down policy, parity for Mataranga Maori in Western science, right? It was sort of declared in the abstract, basically for ideological reasons. Certain interpretations of it maybe don't offend me actually, but it is quite a fairly strong language to use. The other language is mana or ite, equal status for Mataranga Maori in science, right? And so somebody high up has made that decision that shall be the policy, and then handed it on down to the curriculum people to write new curricula. And in some topics, this would be not so hard to do. Some topics have where there's a lot of indigenous knowledge, Mataranga Maori traditions that are relevant, conservation biology, botany, fisheries, all of these areas. You could see that there'd be quite a lot to talk about. But it gets much harder in what I would call the more theoretical and remote from everyday experience sciences, right? So physics, chemistry, evolutionary biology, things like that. And so I get the feeling, this is just a guess, but I get the feeling that there was pressure put on people to find stuff, right? Find stuff to fit this policy. And then you get kind of creative reinterpretations of words, and you get a bit of, round peg, square hole stuff going on. And that may be what produces some of these, you could almost call them anachronisms, right?
It just strikes me that there's quite a big distance between what I might call the sort of default understanding of ancestry, which people at every stage of human history have had. I mean, at least since we started farming and people started to have property to hand on to their offspring. You look at some of the earliest Neolithic sites like Çatalhöyük or Jahu. People have skulls. It's been proposed that actually they start having skulls there because they start becoming obsessed with ancestry. So that kind of thing happens all over the world. But anyway, so that's like kind of the default understanding of like we're related to others in the past and in the future. Okay, you have that. And people also might have an understanding of like, cats are similar to wild cats or something like that. But it's a very complicated thing. And I mean, there's all these false turns that you could take. You might think that things that are actually sort of analogically related, i.e. they're both sort of flying creatures, you might just assume that they're related in terms of their descent, and that might not be true. And there's just so many steps of the argument. And basically, it's only very recently that anybody on Earth has figured a lot of it out. So it's only until Mendel, right, that we actually have a full understanding of inheritance. Even Darwin was just working with, a more simple version of the idea of heredity. And then you have to wait, 70 or 80 years later until Watson and Crick actually figure out the fundamental chemistry of it. So, and it's not disrespecting anybody's culture to say that a lot of cultures didn't have that before recently, because actually European culture didn't have that before recently.
Yeah, and well, so I mean, I agree with all that. I would say, I have actually read some about whakapapa once I moved to New Zealand. I always maybe I have a little more freedom to explore things, because I can always say, well, I'm kind of a dumb American coming here from outside. I'm just learning about this stuff, but and so I can give you kind of a naive take, and you can just dismiss me as a dumb American if you don't like it. But I did try and be less dumb, and I read some of Mary Roberts's articles, because she wrote. She's established figure in biological sciences here at Auckland, and she's been in anthropology departments and things, and she's got Maori background. And anyway, she wrote an article on whakapapa and really explained the kind of Polynesian derived worldview, and how in that worldview, whakapapa, right, it's much more than our literal concept of ancestry, right, of genealogy or phylogenetic trees. There is a little bit of a tree-like structure to it, because you can have a god or an entity from which multiple things are descended, and you can even represent that in a little bit of a tree-like way. But yeah, the concept was it could, the way she talks about it is it encodes a lot of different kinds of information, and not purely genealogical. It encoded functional information about, what items or foods or whatever are good for certain things. It kind of encode cultural information in that, different groups might have different connections to different animals, and in some sense consider that animal or that tree their ancestor. And I think, and I suspect all of that's not totally unique. That kind of thinking maybe some will come of it. But whakapapa, and there was way more to it. This idea of layers, is key to whakapapa. So there's a lot to it. And I think, if I were designing a curriculum, I would say, let's have a unit somewhere discussing whakapapa on its own terms, discussing what it has meant in Te Reo Maori, right? And do that well, do that on its own terms, explain it all. And then when you're doing evolution, do the evolution stuff in the traditional evolution way. And those concepts are quite clear what they mean. And then if you want, it could be an interesting discussion to say, okay, we have these different concepts of relationship, of ancestry, of genealogy, of inheritance, heritage. What do these different points of view say about those concepts, right? And that could be a very interesting discussion. I have attempted a little bit of that kind of thing where I get a chance, at the university. That would be fascinating, and I think eye-opening, and it would reveal a lot of things. Even in evolution, we have different kinds of ancestry, right? You have your sort of literal exact ancestor, but it's not always the same as the ancestor of the bits of DNA in you, because you lose DNA every generation. You only get half the DNA from each parent. So it doesn't take very long before you have a genealogical ancestor who has given you zero DNA, right? And so you can distinguish between all of these things. And similarly, what does the ancestor of a species mean, yada, yada. And then in terms of heritage and inheritance, right, there is a meaningful sense in which the evolutionary history and the phylogenetic tree are giving us some measurement of our inheritance or heritage or biotic heritage on the planet, right? And there are attempts to formalize this, which species should we prioritize for conservation? Maybe the ones that represent sort of deep, unique branches on the phylogenetic tree. And you could have lots of interesting conversations about what these terms mean and from the whakapapa point of view, and maybe there are places where these overlap. That would all be interesting. And I don't know why, that seems so obvious to me that would be the place to explore these things, but it sure seems like what happened in the introductory science curriculum was you just had, sort of this round hole square peg thing going on. You just had these things sort of tapped into the curriculum to try and get them in there to satisfy this policy. It is quite surprising to me. Now, I guess the end of the story is just this. At the end of last year, we heard a bunch of this stuff had been taken out of the chemistry and biology curriculum. And now there's this kind of reduced, it looks a bit bare, the curriculum. There's not, much left. And so now they pushed the whole thing back a year. They were going to roll these out to all students this year. Now it's been pushed back a year. So you get the sense that there's conflict and debate or something going on at the Ministry of Education. So it's all very puzzling. Yeah. So, I find it quite peculiar, and I'm just sort of amazed that I have ended up in this position where these old parts of these old debates are relevant. I think there's an article to be written someday on the history of the science religion debate and the language that was used and the people involved, and then this history of this debate in New Zealand.
It sounds like some kind of action film where
you're
you're
the same.
one of these
Sorry,
action.
go ahead.
It sounds like one of these action films where you're an old hand and the guys come get you for one last mission, and you're like, no,
That's
I don't want to. I just want to do biology.
You've left the tools of war behind, and then it's wild. So I mean, my weakness and the reason I haven't been, super. I've been involved in the Maori thing because it's such a narrow and clear issue. I don't have a lot of confidence in the general New Zealand discussion. I didn't grow up here. I am generally aware of the politics and the points of view, but I probably never will be an expert on it. So I try and stick to the narrow science issues, the places I feel most confident. So that, and probably I'll always be that way a little bit, but I do encourage that broader discussion. It would be interesting to me and probably many people if you had these kinds of things, and there are people who could do it, but I feel like because politics is involved in it all, there's a real tendency for people to avoid it or suppress the discussion. And I find that very peculiar, especially at an institution of higher education.
Well, that's why we had you on, because our attitude on this podcast, Free Kiwis, and elsewhere is just, if the people aren't going to let you have a discussion, it's a free country, we're just going to have it anyway. So, and it doesn't mean we'll have it in a kind of bullshit way. We can have it in a nuanced way and attentive to all the details as you've shown us in this episode. So thanks very much for
appreciate the
doing
chance,
that.
and I'm happy to chat. So thanks very much. Probably we've gone on a while, but anytime.
Thank you, Nick.